All right, we're going to dive in to some of these works by writers of the Harlem Renaissance, and hope that you enjoyed this quick little video and reading these works. Um, we're still in the 20s, so I hope you can see how much literary production, all levels, came out of the United States in the 1920s. So not only was it the Roaring Twenties in terms of partying, but it was also the Roaring Twenties in terms of literary output and production and excitement. It was like something was unleashed itself throughout our country after that war. So I want us to turn, though, to some writers of the Harlem Renaissance and look at what kinds of works that these different poets and writers were producing during the 20s and during this time period. You learned about the Harlem Renaissance, what it was in that particular in that video that you just watched. But just to re-emphasize, the height of the Harlem Renaissance was in the 20s, and through it, writers, artists, musicians were trying to create a new black consciousness, or to bring awareness to a new black consciousness in this country after slavery, after Reconstruction. The Harlem Renaissance was not a school in the sense that these writers did not speak with the unified voice. They weren't trying to advance one specific set of ideas. What they were trying to do, however, was make the statement that America would only be whole by including black voices, that black culture was important to American life itself, and that in order for America to be completely whole culturally, that black voices, black culture, black ideas needed to be heard. The hopes, the frustrations, the dreams, the black experience of the 20s needed to be spoken into the larger American consciousness. And these writers also felt that black creativity had to be recognized if blacks were to find their full human identity in the United States. So although these writers and the artists and the musicians are doing a variety of things, one of the underlying, I think, commonalities is this expression of what it means to be black, what it means to be black in America in the 20s, and to draw attention to that. So we're going to look at a couple of poets first, and then we'll turn to a prose writer. So you read a poem by Countee Cullen and called Yet Do I Marvel. Just a couple of interesting things about Countee Cullen. He was married to W.E.B. Du Bois's daughter for a while, for a short time. That did not end well, but they were married for a while. Countee Cullen valued traditional poetic form. He didn't necessarily advocate a breaking away of traditional forms to express black identity, but to rely on those traditional forms to show the commonality of all people. So that was super important to him. He demanded, not surprisingly then, that black poets be seen as American poets, with no difference, but also felt it was important to write about the black experience. So again, this is just another voice, another microcosm of America that helped to make America what it was at this particular time. And he believed that there was no definite mold that black poets should conform to. In other words, there was no definite agenda. Just expressing the black experience was enough for Countee Cullen. So, Yet Do I Marvel that is the first poem that we had to look at. And this is an exciting poem for me because I love poetic form, and I love to see what poets do with traditional poetic form. Now, we saw none of that with high modernism, because Eliot and Pound were all about exploding form, right? Well, Countee Cullen is here going, no, poetic form is valuable, and it's a valuable form of expression. So I want to point out to you that Yet Do I Marvel is a Petrarchan sonnet. And so this dates back to Petrarch, who was an Italian poet during the Renaissance, right? So hundreds and hundreds of years ago, this poetic form was established. And so all sonnets have 14 lines. A Petrarchan sonnet is going to have an octave, so the first 8 lines, that is going to present and develop a subject. So we will look and see what subject is being developed here in this poem. And then we have a sestet, or the last 6 lines, that are going to provide a resolution, or a solution, or a release, in other words, maybe a proposition, or even some sort of irony. So, in other words, we're building up, we're making a generalization, we're developing a subject in the octave, and then the sestet, we're resolving what we've developed in some types of way. So, let's look at what Countee Cullen does. And if you notice, the rhyme scheme is very particular. The first octave is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D. And then the sestet, you get couplets. You get those rhyming couplets. So it's an accumulation of images, what he's talking about. So let's look at the form and see sort of what he's doing in that initial octave. I doubt not God is good, well-meaning, kind, and did he stoop to quibble, could tell why the little buried mole continues blind, why flesh that mirrors him must someday die. So let's look at that first quatrain. So he's basically acknowledging it's very general, it's very universal. I doubt not that God is good. And then he goes on to these big questions of life. Why does nature behave like it does? And he uses the mole there to reflect all of nature. And then he asks the question, why must we die, right? So these are big, huge, universal questions. Why does nature do what it does? Why do people die? So it's this big presentation of the subject. Then, interestingly, he starts making allusions to classical myth. Make plain the reason. So he's asking God here, explain. Tortured Tantalus is baited by the fickle fruit. Declare if merely brute caprice dooms Sisyphus to struggle up a never-ending stair. And you get in your note who Tantalus and Sisyphus were. So, in Greek mythology, Tantalus was offered food and water that was instantly snatched away. Okay? So, in other words, Tantalus represents human needs and desires that will never be met or fulfilled. So again, he's asking God, or he would be hoping God could answer, why is it that humans have needs and desires that can never be met or fulfilled? And then Sisyphus was doomed to roll a heavy stone to the top of a hill, and after that it rolled back down. And he just repeated that perpetually. So this reference to Sisyphus here shows the futility of human effort. So again, 2 more questions that that people are universal, that people ask. Why are human needs and desires often not met or fulfilled? Why is human effort sometimes futile? So this is the presentation, the proposition, the generalization, the subject of sort of the why God questions, okay? And then what happens in this last sestet, we realize that what he's talking about is really his plight as a black poet, okay? His frustrations. Because he says, inscrutable his ways are. So in other words, we can't understand the ways of God. We can't answer all these questions. And immune to catechism, by a mind too strewn with petty cares to slightly understand what awful brain compels his awful hand. So catechism is just a set of questions and answers that different denominations in the Christian tradition teach their young people as a way of indoctrinating them into their faith. So a catechism is going to attempt to answer these big questions. So he says here, but we cannot understand God's ways. Even catechism doesn't help us understand. We won't understand. And awful here in that line doesn't mean like bad or terrible. It means awe-inspiring, like AWE, awe-inspiring. And so basically he's saying, you know, yet do I marvel at all these things, at the inscrutable ways of God, why things happen the way they do. I cannot answer them. I cannot explain human suffering. I cannot explain why people die. I cannot explain why bad things happen, right? And neither can organized religion. So it's these big, huge universal concepts, why people do marvel, typical questions. But then you look at the last couplet, and he says, yet do I marvel at this curious thing. Colon. So we're about to get the colon. So I don't understand all these things. And you know what I also don't understand? To make a poet black and bid him sing. So what we get is we get all these universal questions, and then we get this last minute turn. And here we get where the final speaker reveals how the speaker finally reveals how crucial race is and has been in his questioning of God. And so we see his labors as a black poet specifically, and maybe a black person in general, being compared to Sisyphus, to Tantalus, to all these universal things. But at the end, he kind of boils it down and basically says, you know, this particular racial dilemma is more marvelous and more unexplainable than all these other situations that we question. So he uses this really old form to raise these really old questions, and then in the last couplet, he flips it and it says, no, but I'm talking about right now. And I'm talking about the black poet's dilemma. And I'm talking about the black person's dilemma. And so I just love how he does this, how he takes that traditional form and makes it new and applies it to the black experience. So super cool poem. All right, Langston Hughes, pause, take a break if you want to. I love these poets. I love this poetry. So forgive me if I get a little bit nerdily excited about talking about some of this stuff. So if it's too much for you, pause me and come back. We'll come back to Langston Hughes. Okay. All right. So Langston Hughes is probably the most well-known of the Harlem Renaissance writers. If you know a Harlem Renaissance poet, you're going to probably know Langston Hughes. He was certainly the most popular and the most versatile. He contributed poetry to two of the magazines, Crisis and Opportunity, that sprang up during the Harlem Renaissance as an expression of a black identity, a black experience. He was very involved with those. He also had his poetry appear in Alan Locke's The New Negro, and that came out in 1925. And many people point to Alan Locke's The New Negro, as well as James Weldon Johnson's Book of American Negro Poetry, as really the two seminal texts, collections of writing that sort of jump-started the Harlem Renaissance. So Hughes was definitely involved with that. He is very interested in portraying the modern black experience, and modern, I mean by the 1920s black experience. He acknowledges he wants black people to be acknowledged at this time as owners of a very rich culture that they gave to the United States, and also as full citizens. So again, going back to that concept that, of what does it mean to be black and American at the same time? Because yes, that's true. And only in seeing this type of art and literature is the United States completely well-rounded and total and fully expressing all of its citizenry. So let's look first at The Negro Speaks of Rivers. And this is probably the most famous of Langston Hughes's poems, or certainly one of the most famous. And so I'm going to look at a couple of things. First of all, in this poem, you really get river as metaphor. And he says, I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. So we get a river here as metaphor for his soul. And if you look at, as he says, my soul has grown deep like the rivers. So it's important that we talk about these particular rivers. So the first river we get is the Euphrates River. And the Euphrates River is in northern Africa. And it's supposed to be, or in the Middle Eastern part of the world. So Middle Eastern, Northern Africa area. And the Euphrates is supposed to be one of the rivers that in biblical tradition that ran through the Garden of Eden. Okay, so we get here a river with connections to early creation, right? So his soul goes back to that river when dawns were young, right? And again, it's a river associated with the northern part of Africa. And then we hear, I built my hut near the Congo. Well, the Congo is a river in central, that flows through Central Africa, okay? So again, and then I looked upon the Nile, which is in Egypt, which is in northern Africa, and the grandness of the pyramids. So all this deep cultural past that he has as a black person that's flowing through his soul, that African past, that tradition, those roots. But then we get, I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans. And so the story about Abe Lincoln goes, y'all know where the Mississippi is, obviously, right? And the story goes that Lincoln was first brought into an understanding of the horrors of the slave trade when he was taking a shipment by flatboat down the Mississippi. And he ended up in New Orleans, and he saw slave trading for the first time, and it changed his life. Okay, so here we see Hughes bringing in the Mississippi River that has such connotations to Southern blacks and to the horrors of slavery and Reconstruction, but that yet was still a part of their identity and a part of his soul. And then he says, I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers, and my soul has grown deep like these rivers. So, in other words, the past is part of his present in his consciousness, and it determines identity. And it's important for the world to recognize that and people to speak of that and value that as part of this experience, not just this black experience, but this American experience. And then we get I Too. And this is another fabulous poem. And we really see here him putting forth a changing American consciousness that includes a black consciousness. So he says, you can see here the dreams and the frustrations, and I'm just going to read it. I too sing America. And he's alluding to Walt Whitman here, who was a very famous poet during this particular, the end of the 19th century. And so he's alluding to that and to Whitman, so like Whitman, he's saying basically, I hear America singing, because Whitman wrote about that same concept. But here he's saying, look, and I too, as a black person, I sing America as well. So I'm the darker brother, but a brother nonetheless, right? They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. So again, that status of the house servant. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong, right? So I'm changing, I'm developing. So I have these, though there are frustrations, I have dreams. And then we get tomorrow. Whenever that is, tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed of the past, ashamed of the discrimination, ashamed of Jim Crow, ashamed of slavery, ashamed of looking at black people as less than. And then he ends by saying, I too am America. So again, you get that real sense that was important in the Harlem Renaissance of, really, really making sure that America knew that it would only be whole by including the black experience and black voices. So again, fabulous stuff. All right, our last person, and again, if you need to pause, that's great. You can pick up with me in a minute. But this is a great piece we read by Zora Neale Hurston. Hurston was born in Notasulga, Alabama, so we can claim her as our own. She moved to Eatonville, Florida when she was a little girl, and she was virtually protected from racism there because this was an all-black community. And it wasn't until she was 13 years old and left Eatonville that she came face to face with racism for the very first time. But it was her upbringing that made her develop into a very confident person that was able to navigate the waters of racism that she faced once she came into adolescence and moved from Eatonville. Like Langston Hughes, she also published in Opportunity. She studied anthropology, and she was very interested in black folk tradition. And she was known in Harlem as a storyteller. And unlike some of the writers of this time, she was not embarrassed to present real-life complex characters, people that did bad things as well as good things. She didn't feel like that she had to worry about a so-called quote-unquote white reaction to her work. She was just going to present characters as she had witnessed them and lived them. Probably her most famous work is Their Eyes Were Watching God. It was not published until 1937, but much of her literary output came in the 20s, as all these peoples did, including what we read of How It Feels to Be Colored Me. So what we get in this particular story then is we get her discussion of herself, of leaving Eatonville, of growing up in Eatonville and what it was like. And in fact, the first line of the second paragraph says, I remember the very day that I became colored. So the day that she recognized that there was racism in the world. And it happened when she was about 13 years old. But what we get in this particular story, and it is autobiographical, she's very positive about her race and her opportunity. We don't get a lament here. We get an incredible amount of strength coming from Hurston. She says, I am not tragically colored. There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all. And she says, it's fine. It's not a big deal to me. I have seen that the world is to the strong, regardless of a little pigmentation more or less. No, I do not weep at the world. I am too busy sharpening my oyster knife. I love that, right? I'm not lamenting. I'm going to be positive. I'm going to go forward. I'm going to move ahead, right? It's a great positive image. And then she goes on in that next paragraph and says, people are always reminding me that I'm the granddaughter of slaves. And she says, but that fails to register depression with me. Slavery is 60 years in the past. The operation was successful and the patient is doing well. Thank you. So, again, so much positivity here, so much sense of opportunity that she's not going to dwell on the past, but that she's going to continue to look forward. And then she says, I'm off to a flying start, right? And I must not halt in the stretch to look behind and weep, right? So kind of this onward charge. And then she says, this, and then this, you feel like she's kind of directly dealing with some of the ideas in the Harlem Renaissance. I have no separate feeling about being an American citizen and colored. I am merely a fragment of the great soul that surges within the boundaries. My country, right or wrong. So it's basically, like Langston Hughes says, I too am an American, right? I don't feel weird. I don't feel less than. I don't feel in any way looked down upon. I know things can be bad, but guess what? I'm fine. She says, sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it doesn't make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It is beyond me. I love that, right? So yes, discrimination is there. Yes, I feel it, but how dare they? So again, super excited. And then she gives this very famous brown bag image at the end of how it feels to be colored me. And it's great. She says, I feel like a brown bag of miscellany propped against a wall in company with other bags, white, red, and yellow. So these bags are people, right? Pour out the contents, and there is discovered a jumble of small things, priceless and worthless. A first water diamond, an empty spool, bits of broken glass, links of string, a key to a door long since crumbled away, a rusty knife blade, old shoes saved for a road that never was and never will be, a nail bent under the weight of things too heavy for any nail, a dried flower or two still a little fragrant, right? So all these little pieces that make people who they are. In your hand is the brown bag. On the ground before you is the jumble it held. So much like the jumble in the bags, could they be emptied, that all might be dumped in a single heap, and the bags refilled without altering the content of any greatly? A bit of colored glass more or less would not matter. Perhaps that is how the great stuffer of bags filled them in the first place. Who knows? So we get that real sense here through Hurston that, basically everybody's the same. Everyone's the same inside, and I love the last thing, the great stuffer of bags. So a real sense that everybody's equal, drawing the reader's attention to that, to what it means to understand people and race in new ways. So I hope you've enjoyed these particular texts. And I know you're happy after the High Renaissance to get things a little bit more accessible, and certainly ones with a very positive message.